defensively, I want to look at another player in this game too, because this was certainly some of the best that we saw of a guy who's been a weird part of this offseason in Jadeveon Clowney, who I think had 10 pressures in this game, was living in the Niners backfield, and now still remains unsigned over the course of this NFL offseason. Mina, as someone who got to see Jadeveon Clowney as up close and personal as you did, are you surprised, and maybe this game is a backdrop, are you surprised this is a guy that's still sitting out in the ether right now?
Yes and no. So this game, this performance by Jadeveon, I would argue, is the single most dominant performance by a defensive player the entire season, any team. He just flat took over this football game, and it's incredible to watch. Like, that is, to me, is the most fun part of this game that you guys are about to watch. But not the case every game. I mean, I wouldn't say he disappeared in games, because he often contributes, as you guys know, to defenses in ways that don't show up in the box score. It's part of the reason why he's better liked by advanced statistic and tracking statistics than, stats or even quarterback hits. Terrific run defender as well. But what you're about to see is not sort of his, I guess, who he is as a player, frankly, consistently. He's just not a dominant pass rusher of the Mac, Miller, et cetera, variety. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect between, his desire, or there was his desire to be paid like a premium pass rusher, and how he is perceived around the NFL. Throw in the fact that he was banged up through a lot of this season. We learned afterwards, and given everything that's happening with the coronavirus pandemic, teams perhaps haven't been able to get a good look at him independently using their own doctors. So, he said he wanted to wait, I guess, and let it play out a bit. All that said, I certainly think Seattle could use him next year, given the utter dearth of a pass rush. I mean, I think the top pass rusher, their sack leader last year was Rasheem Green with 4 sacks. 90% of people watching at home are like, who's Rasheem Green? They just did not get much production up front, and they didn't bolster that area. They have money to spend. There's been some speculation about maybe an Everson Griffin out there, or even a trade for an Ngakoue, which doesn't seem totally likely. But I think they should just bring back Clowney, especially if he's going to come in at, significantly less than $20 million a year, which is what people speculated before the season ended.
I think it's interesting, though, when you have the Jadeveon Clowney conversation, we've seen so often that it's rare for great players to just be able to walk away from their teams, especially in their prime. It's rare that a team lets a guy like that out of the building. Now you have 2 franchises, not just the Seahawks, but the Texans before them, that were willing to let Jadeveon Clowney walk out of their building. That has to, in my mind, say something about Jadeveon, even not just on film, but Jadeveon behind the scenes, because it just boggles the mind to me that 2 teams at this point, 2 different franchises, would let him walk. I mean, Mike, I see you're laughing, but to me, it's got to say something.
No, I'm going to guess Mike's laughing because we're talking about the Texans, maybe? Okay, yes. I was going to say, a few great players have walked out of that building.
That is a fair point. But for the Seahawks, who are a model franchise in the minds of many, to then replicate that says something.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it speaks to necessarily, by all accounts, he was beloved in that locker room, really embraced Seattle. But I do think it speaks to the perception of his contribution as a football player. Because again, if you were to only watch the game you were about to watch, if you were an alien and you landed on Earth and you said, I'm going to watch football, you would turn this game on and think that is the best player in the history of the sport, watching what you're about to see tonight. It is not, unfortunately, represented. I think he's a great player, but what we're about to see is, I'm not going to say it's like, the new Radicals, you get what you give, one-hit wonder level territory, but there's no other games like this coming out of him this year.
Can a player I think that's the Jadeveon Clowney story going all the way back to college, is this guy is so defined by that alien stature, physical ability, that splash plays. Because when he makes it, it looks spectacular. It looks unlike what anyone else in the world can do, going all the way back to the shot heard around the world against Michigan in that bowl game. That is always what's defined this guy. And even now, in like a pass rush win rate era where we know all these ways where he's impacted games, you're still ultimately paid by your ability to effectively and consistently, like Mina's pointed out, get to the quarterback in ways that are still maybe quantified a little more normally than what we're seeing now. And Clowney, whether it's been going all the way back, because you mentioned Houston, Mina mentioned being banged up last year. That is also part of the Jadeveon Clowney story in a major way, especially early on in his Houston career. Him and J.J. Watt really kind of handed the baton off somewhere in the middle along that when J.J. went down and dealt with a lot of that back stuff. And you saw that crescendo, that final tap into the talent that we had seen for Clowney. So it's a complicated case that, like Mina mentioned, is only made worse by the current situation for the world.
If there's only one thing that we can bring of this show, if the two of you with your collective power could find a phrase better than pass rush win rate that we can all acknowledge is the most difficult thing ever. Like, I got to slow down and just make it through
it's
pass
the R
rush
and the
win
W
rate.
and the R. It's like Russell Westbrook, how you always say Russell Westbrook, because it's those two consonants. Yeah, it's tough.
Every time.
So when to wrap up the Clowney conversation, you guys, and Mina, you mentioned you think he'd be a good fit to come back to Seattle.
Yeah.
Do you believe that an athlete that thought his market value was going to be incredibly high is more or less likely to go back to a place that he knows, but he's going, and particularly in his mind, an undervalued contract?
I think he is a very strategic, savvy guy, and I think he wants to rebuild his value at this point. That would be my guess. I mean, it was reported, I want to say last week, that the Browns extended the most generous offer thus far, and he turned it down. We don't know what that was. We don't know why, but it's entirely possible that was a long-term offer, and he believes that he could play for another 1-year deal and potentially then get a long-term deal if he stays healthy. Perhaps he feels that that's a defense he can thrive in, where they understand his role and how to utilize him. I might be trying to, manifest reality and be wishfully thinking, because it's hard to know what he wants. But strategically, I have to think if his value has truly plummeted in the way that the amount of time that's transpired suggests it has, I think it wouldn't hurt him to just sign a 1-year deal at a place like Seattle.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.